We carry on. You didn't know it would take this long, did you? But I'm hoping there's something good in it for you. All right, in the historical case for the resurrection of Christ, the first point, this large point that I'm driving after, is that the disciples sincerely believed Jesus had been resurrected. They were certain of that. They had that conviction. And we know they had that conviction. There are several lines of it. You say, well, how do you know that? Well, there are several lines of evidence that demonstrate they had that. The first of which is the one I'm on right now. Okay, this is the first line of evidence to demonstrate that they sincerely believed this. They were certain of it. And the first line of evidence is they claimed that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. And I'm currently presenting the evidence that proves. You say, well, how do you know that these people thousands of years ago made that claim? What evidence do you have of that? And I'm presenting the evidence that they did in fact make that claim. And the first is we have Paul's testimony. Paul makes the claim in his undisputed letters. He tells us the other apostles made the claim. And Luke corroborates that testimony in Acts. And then we have the four Gospels. They report that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to the first disciples. But unlike those 7 letters of Paul that virtually all scholars accept were written by Paul in the middle of the first century, see, unlike those, there's debate about the authorship and the date of the Gospels. And thus there's a question whether the Gospels reflect the claims of the early disciples, whether what they report can be tied to the first disciples, right? Because you have this debate about, well, when were they written? Were they written a long time later? We don't know who wrote them. So then you have to say, well, if that were the case, there'd be a question of whether they reflect the claims of the first disciples. Can you tie them, the Gospels, to the claims of the first disciples? And therefore, I'm giving some of the reasons for thinking that the Gospels are historically reliable evidence of the claims of the first disciples. And to do that, we first look there. I talked about their reliability generally, and I'm now discussing their reliability in terms of these broad diagnostic questions that historians typically ask of ancient writings when they're trying to determine, are they historically reliable? And last week we saw that in terms of the Gospels that the authors include details that risk damaging their own cause, which they wouldn't do unless they were interested in remaining faithful to history. The authors include incidental details and casual information, which suggests they were presenting factual data, material derived from an eyewitness perspective. There's sufficient consistency within and between the Gospels to preserve their general reliability. And the Gospels do not report events or make claims that seem inherently improbable, provided one is willing to entertain the possibility of God's existence and His working of miracles. Now, when we ended, I was discussing criterion 5. And that's namely that the gospel accounts are corroborated by as much external literary evidence as reasonably can be expected. And I mentioned Thales, who's a first century historian whose works we know about from the later Christian historian Julius Africanus. I mentioned the first century Jewish historian Josephus. I mentioned the letter of Pliny the Younger, written around AD 112, who was a Roman governor in Bithynia. And I mentioned the work of Cornelius Tacitus, the Annals of Rome, that he wrote in AD 115. Now, I want to mention a couple others around AD 166. Okay, so Tacitus writes around AD 115, early 2nd century. Go down the road a little bit, around AD 166, we have the Greek satirist, Lucian of Samosata. He warned his readers about the dangers of Christianity in a work titled The Death of Peregrinus. And in that work, he refers to Jesus as the man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult into the world. And he says the Christians' first lawgiver persuaded them that they are all brothers of one another after they've transgressed once for all by denying the Greek gods and by worshiping the crucified sophist himself and living according to his laws. So here we have this opponent of Christianity. He didn't question that Jesus was crucified and that he was the origin of a new religion in which he was worshipped. So we have some support coming there in around AD 175, just a little after Lucian. He's around 166, 175, a Roman philosopher. Celsus, he wrote a full-scale attack on Christianity titled True Doctrine. And his work hasn't survived, but we know of his work from the 3rd century, around 250. Origen, a theologian and Christian theologian and philosopher, rebutted Celsus's work, and in doing so, he quoted from it extensively. So that's how we know about his work. And Celsus, he argues, among other things, that Jesus amazed his small following by displays of sorcery and magic that he learned in Egypt. And here's what Origen on Celsus says. In the first place, Celsus, accuses him, Jesus, of having invented his birth from a virgin and upbraids him as an illegitimate child who, having hired himself out as a servant in Egypt on account of his poverty and having there acquired some miraculous powers on which the Egyptians greatly pride themselves, returned to his own country, highly elated on account of them, and by means of these proclaimed himself a god. So what's important is that even this critic of Christianity, such a strong, harsh critic of Christianity as Celsus, he didn't challenge the belief that Jesus performed miracles. He accepted that, and rather he attributed it to Jesus being a sorcerer or a magician, something that he picked up in Egypt. Now, the final standard of the standard criteria of reliability is that the gospel accounts also are corroborated by archaeological evidence. Now, I'm only going to give you just a few, some of the more interesting finds. But shortly after the turn of the 20th century, you see here the Pool of Bethesda that's mentioned in John chapter 5. That was discovered in Jerusalem. And you see here many fragments of column bases, capitals, and drums. They were found, which probably belonged to the 5 porches, that is, the porticos or colonnaded walkways of the pool that John mentions. And that was a quote from John McRae. And we have an inscription that was discovered in 1962 that refers to Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, confirming that he reigned in that position, that position that's attributed to him in the Gospels. Now, of course, we have other evidence of Pilate. You have coins, you have literary evidence, but I'm just giving you archaeological, physical artifacts. And so here we have this carving, this inscription that refers to him. Now, in excavations that were begun in Capernaum in the 1960s, they uncovered a simple 1st century house in Capernaum that was beneath a 4th century house church, which was itself beneath a 5th century octagonal church. So we'd had a series of buildings. We have a 1st century house, under a 4th century house church, and then under a 5th century octagonal church. So something is happening with this particular site. And on the walls of one of the rooms of that 1st century house are inscribed a variety of Christian prayers from the 2nd century. So from early on, Christians had considered something special, significant about this particular site. And a number of leading scholars across the theological waterfront A number of leading scholars are convinced that this is in fact the home of the Apostle Peter. Just to give you an example, J. Murphy O'Connor, who just has a great deal of information about the archaeology of Jerusalem, he says, certitude as to the original ownership of the room is of course impossible. That's just the way historical inquiry is. It's not like math. Okay, certitude as to the original ownership of the room is of course impossible, but the evidence is of consistent veneration in the pre-Constantinian period, Constantine, early 4th century. Before that, you have this consistent veneration of this spot in Capernaum. He says, demands an explanation. The most reasonable assumption is the one attested by the Byzantine pilgrims. So we have some information back in history, these people saying, hey, namely that it was the house of Peter in which Jesus may have lodged. Certainly nothing in the excavations contradicts this identification. So I just always say, now it looks different than the slide I gave you there. It looks different. They've got like a museum built around it now. But that's the octagonal church that was there. Now we have, this is in 1990, you had this ornate ossuary. An ossuary is a burial bone box. Because the way they did burials in Palestine in the first century was they would put you on a shelf until all your flesh rotted away. And then they would come back and they would gather the bones and put them in a bone box called an ossuary. And so that was the burial practice then. And so in 1990, you see this ornate ossuary was discovered south of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem by workers who were building a water park. And they come across this, and it's inscribed in Aramaic with the name Caiaphas. And many leading scholars have concluded that it is indeed the actual ossuary of the high priest who handed Jesus over to Pilate. So here we have Caiaphas's ossuary. And in 2002, Biblical Archaeology Review published an ossuary with an inscription in Aramaic reading James. That's how it's translated. It's, of course, really Jacob or Yaakov. But it's translated James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Now, before he published that find, Herschel Shanks, who is the Jewish editor of the magazine, Biblical Archaeology Review, he had the inscription authenticated by two leading epigraphers, and he had the ossuary itself authenticated by the Geological Survey of Israel. Nevertheless, the Israel Antiquity Authority, they had been left out of the loop regarding the find. They prosecuted the ossuary's owner, a guy named Oded Golan. They prosecuted him for forgery. And after a trial that went on more than 7 years, the verdict was that he was not guilty. This verdict, so we have it declared not guilty on March 14, 2012. And Herschel Shanks, the editor of the journal, he's laid out the evidence. In his view, he says it leaves, quote, no doubt, end quote, that the inscription is authentic. And he has blistered the Israel Antiquities Authority for its unsubstantiated claims and its groundless political prosecution of Golan. Indeed, it's significant that Israel's leading epigrapher, these people who their world is studying inscriptions, ancient inscriptions, but it's significant that their leading epigrapher in Israel, Ada Yardeni, declares, quote, if this is a forgery, I quit, end quote. Okay, so, but you always have the taint, see, because he was accused, they had the trial and all that stuff. But this was discovered there. Now, in 2004, the Pool of Siloam, that's mentioned in John chapter 9, is discovered in Jerusalem, supplanting an earlier site that had been mistakenly believed to be the Pool of Siloam. So you have this. So you have many things like this. A lot of things. I just gave you a few highlights here, but you have many other references in the New Testament to buildings, cities, rulers, people, customs, geographical details, political situations. These things have all been corroborated, confirmed by secular sources. Now, for a thorough presentation of the archaeological evidence of the New Testament before 1991, you can look at McRae's book, John McRae's book on archaeology in the New Testament. And I've done a class on this that Bernard has recorded on archaeology in the Bible. I don't remember how long it goes, 9 classes or something like that, where we go through, and he did a really good job of putting up the images of the artifacts in the video. And to get to that, let me give you a primer here. My website, my personal website is theoutlet.us, not org, not whatever, not com, theoutlet.us. People ask me, how can I find this stuff? Well, here it is. If you go to that thing, you'll see that site, you'll see on the side over there this series of buttons. Okay, home, Bible books, all that. If you go down to the bottom and you click audio and video, it'll take you to a page that includes this link to the YouTube channel. Now, the YouTube channel is Bernard's. Bernard maintains the YouTube channel where he puts the classes and things that he records. If you click the YouTube channel link, you'll then go here and it'll have this lovely looking dude here. We keep it blurred out. It's like Vaseline on aging actors, they over the lens. But if you go here, the page will include this, and you could click videos or playlists and then just look for archaeology in the Bible. And so it has the New Testament and Old Testament, New Testament, but there's a lot of stuff there. Now, back here, if you just want the notes, if you just want the notes, which include the pictures, and you want to look at those, then you just go here and you click Bible studies and look for archaeology and the Bible. So, all right, that's all you get from me on that. Now, so here, the disciples believed the first line of evidence they claimed. Why do you think that? We've got Paul's testimony. We've got the 4 Gospels. The 4 Gospels are reliable. They are tied to the early disciples. Their reliability generally, their reliability supported by the standard criteria employed by historians, and their reliability regarding the resurrection accounts specifically. Okay, there I'm giving you things that are about why do you think that the Gospels are reliable indicators of what the first disciples claimed? Now I want to talk specifically, just briefly, about why they're reliable in terms of the resurrection accounts specifically. And there are 4 features that indicate those resurrection accounts are very early rather than later inventions. There are 4 little subtle things that when you're tuned in, you can say, oh, I can see that supports that they're early. And first is that they're almost devoid of biblical quotations, allusions, and echoes. See, which suggests that they reflect an oral tradition, you see, that was formed and set firmly in the memory of different storytellers before there was time for biblical reflection. In other words, the form of the story got set early, because if it hadn't, then included in those stories would have been later reflection about the significance. And so you would have allusions to Bible quotes, and these different kinds of things would get in there as you had later theological reflection. But these things got frozen right early. And so you have a lack of those kinds of things. And secondly, the women are the principal witnesses. The women are the principal witnesses in the resurrection accounts. And as Darrell Bach says in the recent book, Raised on the Third Day, published just in 2020, Bach says, the point emerges that although it is false to claim that women were never allowed to be witnesses, it was rarely the case, taking place only in very limited situations. A fabricated event would be unlikely to create a story using a set of second-tier witnesses to make a point about a controversial idea. If you're spinning a yarn that you're trying to sell, you wouldn't have key witnesses be people who were second-tier witnesses. Look, I'm making it up. I can put anybody in there I want. I'll put the king in there. All right, so he goes on. He says, in the gospel accounts, women are the lone witnesses to the initial awareness of an empty tomb. They alone hear an angelic announcement that God had raised Jesus from the dead. There's no reason to expect a fabricated story to go there unless it took place this way. And I think that's right. So here you have one of these subtle things about in the resurrection account itself that helps cement the tie back to the early Christians, to the first generation. And the third is that the resurrected Jesus isn't said to shine like a star. That may seem odd. But you could see that, you see. That's what you'd expect based on Daniel chapter 12, verse 3. If the account was a latter-day fabrication or something based after long theological reflection, you could see how from Daniel 12:3 that would be incorporated in there. And then the fourth piece is that they never mention the future hope that those who belong to Jesus will likewise be resurrected. If the story were a later invention, this is again this idea of how theology would be reflected in it. Certainly there would be a tie. There would be mentions in the resurrection accounts themselves that, by the way, he's the first fruits. You too are, and you don't have that. So it indicates that what you have here is a form that got frozen early. And so the earlier we go back, the better evidence it is of what the initial disciples claimed. All right, so that's why I'm giving you that. Now we also have, let me get back here. We have several, so disciples, I'm driving this, they sincerely believe this. Something convinced them of this and gave them idea. So they claim that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. We've got Paul's testimony. We've got the four Gospels. We also have reports of sermons. So for the four Gospels, I've spent maybe more time than you wanted me to, trying to get you to see why are the four Gospels useful evidence of what the first disciples claimed. I had to do that because of this greater question about when were they written and who wrote them, okay? So the third thing is you have reports of sermons and speeches in Acts. Luke recounts in Acts a number of sermons and speeches. In Acts chapters 1 through 5, chapter 10, chapter 13, chapter 17. And most scholars agree, for various reasons, most scholars agree that the summaries he gives of those sermons, that those summaries are based on the earliest teachings of the church, even when the scholars think that the particular speeches that Luke reports never happened. Okay, you have scholars like that, but even those guys who say, I think Luke just made this event up, that this sermon was given, rather than summarizing something that actually occurred. You have some people say, no, I think he just made it. But even those people think that what he's doing here, that it's based on the earliest teachings of the church. Okay, so even when they think that Luke has invented the speeches, they still believed that he conveyed through those speeches the essence of early Christian teaching, and that those speeches expressed the conviction that Jesus rose from the dead. Okay? First Christian teaching. What I'm saying is they claim that. So even the speeches that are recorded in Acts are good evidence for what did the first disciples claim. Those speeches say that Jesus rose from the dead. And we have other New Testament writings. The writer of Hebrews was familiar with the early leaders of the congregations to which he wrote. You see in Hebrews 13:7. And he was a companion of Timothy. Hebrews 13:23, who most likely was the Timothy who traveled with Paul. And the writer of Hebrews declared in Hebrews 13:20 that God raised Jesus from the dead. And you have other New Testament writings which were read publicly in the churches of the first century. Now, a little footnote here. You do have some critical scholars who would put First Peter and 2 Timothy in the early 2nd century, many who wouldn't, but there are some. So with that footnote, you still have plenty here of that letters that are read publicly in the churches of the first century, and they all express a shared belief in the resurrection of Christ. So I hope you're seeing how potent this is. You can't get away from it. If you want to say they didn't say that, they didn't believe that, they didn't present that and preach that, well, then you're just going against an incredible amount of historical evidence to say that. And lastly, we have Clement of Rome and Polycarp. Now, Clement was a leader of the church in Rome at the end of the first century. He writes a letter from Rome to the church in Corinth around AD 95. That letter is known as First Clement. And we have that letter. Now, according to a writing of Irenaeus, dated around AD 185, and a writing of Tertullian, dated around AD 200, Clement was personally acquainted with the apostles. So Clement is in Rome. He writes a letter to Corinth in AD 95. Later writings say that this guy Clement was personally acquainted with the apostles. And in his letter, First Clement, AD 95, Clement mentions the apostles' belief in and preaching of the resurrection of Christ. Now, Polycarp was a leader of the church in Smyrna. And we have a letter that Polycarp wrote to the church in Philippi. It's dated around AD 110 to AD 117, early 2nd century. And according to Irenaeus, Polycarp sat at the feet of the apostle John, and he was appointed to his office in Smyrna by the apostles. And in his letter, Polycarp refers a number of times to Jesus' resurrection. Okay? So, disciples believed he'd been resurrected. Why do you think that? I think that there are several lines of evidence. The first line of evidence that they sincerely believed that is that they claimed he rose from the dead and appeared to them. Why do you think they claimed that? Paul's testimony, the four Gospels, the reports of the sermons, other New Testament writings, Clement of Rome and Polycarp. Well, what is the second line of evidence in support of the disciples sincerely believe? Well, we have facts and circumstances that confirm the sincerity of the belief. All right, so we can know that they sincerely believed Jesus had been resurrected, that they were fully convinced of this. They were fully convinced of this. We know that because we have multiple early and independent sources. They make it clear that they believed and proclaimed that. That's what they're saying. He appeared to me. He's raised from the dead. They're all saying that. But we have more than that. We don't only have them telling us what they believed, what they preached. There are numerous facts and circumstances that confirm or corroborate what these multiple early and independent sources tell us about the early disciples' belief. In other words, we not only have direct evidence that the early disciples were convinced Jesus rose from the grave, we also have evidence of the effect one would expect such a belief to produce. We have evidence of that. It's like having testimony from multiple moviegoers. All right, testimony from multiple moviegoers that they believed there was a fire in the theater. And having evidence that they broke through the doors and fled in a panic. Okay, so you not only have them saying, this is what I thought and believed, you have corroborating evidence of their acting consistently with that belief. Okay, so you have the actions that corroborate what they're telling you. And we have that when we look at the New Testament and the early Christians' belief. When they tell us we believe this, we not only have their direct testimony, we have corroborating evidence of their conduct consistent with what they're telling us. And leading the hit parade here is Paul's reversal. Paul's change of life. Paul went from being a persecutor of Christians to one who zealously promoted the Christian faith. He was a persecutor. He hated them. He was trying to kill them. And then he went to being a zealous preacher and promoter of the Christian faith, which is exactly the kind of about-face that one would expect if Paul was convinced he'd seen the resurrected Christ. Right? I'm after these people. They're heretics. They're not right. They're opposed to the law. Now what am I doing? Jesus is Lord. He's raised from the dead. Well, what happened? Well, if the resurrected Christ appeared to him, that would explain what happened. Right? So we have that going on. Now we know Paul initially was a persecutor of the church because we have his firsthand admission of that fact in letters intended to be read publicly that were written within about 20 years of his persecuting activity. So it'd be like if I wrote somebody here and said, back when I was killing people at the Mesa Church, I was persecuting everybody, way back in 2000. Well, if that's not true, so we have his firsthand. Besides that, Paul is not proud at this point, right? Paul is a zealous preacher. So he's no longer proud of this. So this is an admission against interest. He's ashamed, but that's the truth. He was a persecutor of the church, and we know it from that. And he also reports in Galatians chapter 1, 22 and 23 that he was known as a persecutor of the faith among the churches in Judea. So as I say, he wasn't proud that he once persecuted servants of his Lord. But the very fact he will acknowledge that and admit it, this has tremendous credibility. Tremendous credibility. And on top of this, these things are corroborated by Luke, that Paul was in fact a persecutor of believers. And we also know that Paul became a tireless preacher of the gospel. All of his letters in the book of Acts make that undeniable, that he was a tireless preacher of the gospel. You see in 2 Corinthians 11, 23 to 28, we have his firsthand summary of some of how he suffered for his faith in Christ. So he was a persecutor. And then he turned to this person. Are they servants of Christ? I'm speaking as being out of my mind. I'm more of one, with more labors, more imprisonments, beatings beyond measure, and frequent deaths. 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and day in the deep. On many journeys I was in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my people, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, in danger among false brothers. I've lived with labor and toil, many sleepless nights, hunger and thirst, many fastings, cold and nakedness. Apart from the additional things, there is the daily pressure on me, my worry over all the churches. So what happened to Paul? Right? Historically certain he was a persecutor. Historically certain he was a zealous preacher. Whoop. Well, what in the world happened, you see? Well, his suffering for the faith, it's also reported here, by the way, in 1 Clement, Paul's suffering. And Paul doesn't leave us just to wonder about what happened. We could infer what happened. But he doesn't leave us just to wonder about it or to infer it, because he tells us. His turnabout was motivated by his seeing the resurrected Christ. He tells us flat out that's what did it. And you can see that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 8 to 10. Galatians chapter 1, verses 13 to 16, which is again corroborated by Acts. So in terms of we have what they say, we also have corroborating evidence where they act consistently with how you would expect somebody to be impacted. The effect of this conviction they say they have, it is confirmed by their actions. Second is James's reversal. So we have James's reversal. James, the Lord's brother, he likewise went from being a skeptic about Jesus to being a fully devoted disciple. That Jesus' brothers were skeptical about him being the Messiah. That's reported in John 7:5. But it's also evident in the earlier works of Mark and Matthew. Mark reports in Mark 3:21 that Jesus' family was saying he's out of his mind. They're coming to get him. He's crazy. He's just lost his mind. Mark 6:4 and Matthew 13:57, Jesus included the prophet's own household among the places in which he was not honored, which may suggest that there are unbelievers in his household. The report that Jesus entrusted his mother to John when he was dying on the cross in John 19:26 suggests that James at that point was not a believer. And the fact that none of the Gospels ever mention James being a believer, that's strong evidence that he wasn't a believer then, because he later becomes a leader in the church. And so his early belief would have been a positive thing, and it would have certainly have been indicated or reported. And there's no mention of that. So he wasn't an early believer. That's just, it wasn't how it was. We know from Galatians 1:19, 2:9, Acts 12:17, 15, Acts 15:12-21, and from the 2nd century writings of a Greek author named Hegesippus. We know his work through Eusebius. But we know this, that James became a leader of the church in Jerusalem. So he's not a believer. He's not on board early. We know he becomes a leader of the church in Jerusalem. And there's good reason to believe that James authored the letter in the New Testament that bears his name. This is his letter. And you see in there, he opens it with a declaration that he's a slave of God, of the Lord Jesus Christ. So he's really made a turn, hasn't he? He's a skeptic. He's not a believer. He's a leader of the church. He declares that he's a slave of the Lord Jesus Christ. And Hegesippus and Clement of Alexandria, who wrote around AD 200, they tell us that James was martyred for his faith. And the 1st century Jewish historian Josephus indicates the same thing when he says that James was stoned for, quote, breaking the law, end quote. He was stoned for breaking the law, and this almost certainly has to do with the alleged blasphemy that resulted from he was accused of from his faith in Christ, which would parallel the situation of Stephen in Acts chapter 7. So here we have, he doesn't believe, he's a leader of the church, Jesus is Lord, he's martyred for his faith. What happened? What happened to him? Well, Paul, who we know from his letters in Acts, knows James personally. Well, he reports in a letter to be read publicly during James' lifetime that after Jesus was raised from the dead, that he appeared to his brother James. That would do it. You see, that would do it. What happened to you, James? What turned you from this skeptical unbeliever to somebody who Jesus is Lord and was martyred? Well, Paul tells us. He appeared to his brother James. Just as he appeared to Paul, he appears to his brother James. And so that would account for this radical reversal. And since Jesus' brothers, they're among those praying before Pentecost in Acts chapter 1, verse 14, it seems if James is in that group, which is, it seems, a fair assumption, that he'd converted by then. So that would be within the 40 days, you see, when Jesus was here teaching and with the disciples. That would be the appearance when Paul says that the Lord appeared to his brother James, and then he's one of the disciples there. All right. So here we have facts and circumstances confirm the sincerity of this belief. We have Paul's reversal, right? Remember how I'm doing this. We went through, I went through all this stuff about they claim this, their testimony, what Paul says, what the Gospels say, all of that. Okay, now I'm looking at the effects. You have evidence of effects that corroborate what they tell us they believe, because it's just like the situation with the fire in the theater, and it's the people running out, fleeing in a panic. Okay, so we have Paul's reversal, we have James' reversal, then we also have the disciples continued to believe in Jesus as Messiah after his crucifixion. They continued to believe in Jesus as Messiah after his crucifixion. The early disciples believed he was the Messiah despite the fact he had been crucified. Now there were a number of messianic and prophetic movements in and around Palestine before and after Jesus' ministry. There were a number of these movements whose leader was put to death. You see here's a listing of some of them. They include Judas the Galilean, the Samaritan, Theudas, the Egyptian, Jesus son of Ananias, Menachem the son of Judas the Galilean, Simon Bar of Giora, Lucius Andreas, and Simon Bar Kokhba. And so you had a number of these kinds of messianic or prophetic movements before and after Jesus. And when their leader was killed, the followers either gave up the struggle or they found a new Messiah. That happened all the time. They either gave up the struggle, just went home, or they found a new Messiah. No one continued to claim that their dead leader was the Messiah. On the contrary, his being killed was taken as proof that he was not the Messiah. Right? Do you remember Cleopas? We had hoped. We had hoped. What do you mean you had hope? We had hope, but the fact he was crucified shows he wasn't the guy. He was killed. Well, that's how they all reacted. But you have the disciples who continued to believe that Jesus is the Messiah despite the fact he had been crucified. And the fact that they did that, they proclaimed him as the Messiah despite his having been killed, and they had no impulse to either abandon the movement or to seek another Messiah. It only makes sense in light of their belief that he had in fact been resurrected. How do you explain it? Okay, so it's one of the things that corroborates. I know how to explain it. They tell me how to explain it. They say he appeared, he was resurrected. That was the 180, that was the mind blower. That's through the looking glass. This thing is not the way we think it is. And so they tell us what happened. They tell us all about that this had happened. And then I got 1 minute, so we'll see how we do with this. I have no minutes. Next week, Lord willing.